It was a night of glitter and pride. The chandeliers of the Grand Lumiere Hall sparkled like 1,000 tiny suns, casting golden light over polished marble floors. The air was heavy with perfume, laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. It was the kind of night where the wealthy gathered not just to celebrate, but to show the world how high above everyone else they truly stood. At the center of it all stood Richard Beaumont, a man whose wealth was only matched by his arrogance. His voice was loud, his laughter louder, and everywhere he went people moved aside as if the ground itself belonged to him. Richard loved two things: showing off his fortune and humiliating anyone he thought beneath him. That night his eyes landed on someone unexpected. Sitting quietly at a corner table was a man dressed simply, almost out of place among the glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos. His black jacket looked worn, his hair a little unkempt. He wasn't surrounded by admirers, nor did he command attention. It was Keanu Reeves. Most people in that room didn't even recognize him at first glance. To them, he was just another ordinary guest in an extraordinary place. And to Richard Beaumont, he looked like the perfect target. Richard's lips curled into a mocking smile. He raised his glass, leaned back, and spoke just loud enough for those around him to hear. "Tell me, who let the piano boy into my party?" Laughter rippled across the hall, shallow and cruel. Heads turned toward Keanu. Some guests smirked, others whispered. But Keanu remained still, sipping quietly, his calm eyes betraying no reaction. Richard wasn't satisfied. He wanted a scene. He wanted this nobody to be broken in front of everyone. He stood swaggering across the room until he reached the corner where Keanu sat. "Well," Richard sneered, "if you're going to sit in my hall, maybe you should at least earn your place. Why don't you play us something on the piano?" The crowd chuckled. A few gasped at the audacity, but Richard's booming voice drowned them all out. "Come on now," he insisted, waving toward the shining grand piano at the center of the hall. "Surely you know how to press a few keys. Entertain us, piano boy." The insult hung in the air like poison. All eyes locked on Keanu. The wealthy elite leaned in, hungry for a spectacle, and in that moment, the room waited. Would he refuse? Would he embarrass himself? Or would something entirely unexpected happen? The hall echoed with laughter. Richard Beaumont's mocking voice carried through the air, wrapping around every corner of the grand room like a net, trapping Keanu in its center. Guests turned in their seats, eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation. Some covered their mouths to stifle a laugh, others whispered behind jeweled hands, and a few shook their heads in silent disapproval. Keanu Reeves, however, did not flinch. He sat there, quiet, almost as if the storm around him hadn't touched him at all. His calmness only irritated Richard further. "What's the matter?" Richard sneered, tilting his head like a predator toying with prey. "Afraid the keys might bite?" The crowd chuckled again. A man at the back muttered, "This should be fun," while a young woman whispered, "Poor guy doesn't stand a chance." Richard, eager to drag the scene out, stepped aside dramatically and gestured toward the piano, a magnificent Steinway grand that gleamed under the chandelier's glow. Its black surface reflected the golden light, its ivory keys waiting untouched. "Play," Richard demanded. "Show us what you've got." For the first time, Keanu moved. Slowly, gracefully, he rose from his chair. The room quieted a little, curiosity beginning to outweigh mockery. His every step toward the piano was steady, unhurried, the stride of a man who carried no fear yet revealed nothing of his intent. Richard smirked, leaning close to a guest and whispering, "Watch this. He'll make a fool of himself in seconds." Keanu reached the piano and paused. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he ran a gentle hand along the polished edge as though greeting an old friend. The hall watched in uneasy silence now, the tension shifting in ways no one expected. He lowered himself onto the bench, adjusted it slightly, straightened his posture. His fingers hovered just above the keys, but he didn't play yet. The crowd leaned in. Richard grew impatient. "Well, we don't have all night. Tap a few notes for us, piano boy." But Keanu didn't answer. His eyes were calm, focused, almost meditative, and then he pressed a single key. A soft note rang out, delicate yet piercing in the silence. Then another, and another. Slowly, carefully, he began to weave the beginnings of a melody, quiet, fragile, like the first drops of rain before a storm. The crowd stilled. Whispers faded. Something about those notes felt different. They weren't random. They weren't clumsy. They carried weight, emotion, story. Richard's mocking grin faltered ever so slightly. Narrator's voice. What began as an attempt to humiliate was about to turn into something no one in that room could ever forget. And as Keanu's hand settled fully on the keys, the hall braced for what was to come. The first few notes hung in the air like whispers, fragile yet undeniable. They didn't come from a man forced into humiliation. They came from an artist speaking in a language deeper than words. At first, the crowd didn't know how to react. Some tilted their heads, expecting clumsy playing. A few smirked, waiting for the mistake that would prove Richard Beaumont right. But as the notes flowed, smooth and deliberate, their smirks faltered. Keanu's hands moved with a strange tenderness, as though the piano wasn't an instrument, but a living soul. His fingers glided across the ivory keys, weaving a melody that felt both haunting and familiar. It was soft, almost hesitant, like a memory returning from the shadows of time. Each note seemed to fall exactly where it was meant to, painting emotions across the silence. Sorrow, longing, and hope tangled together. The guests leaned forward, their breaths unconsciously stilled. A young woman in a silver dress blinked rapidly, her laughter from moments ago replaced with quiet awe. An elderly man at the far table closed his eyes, his hand resting against his chest as though the melody had reached a place he thought long buried. Richard Beaumont, however, shifted uncomfortably. His mocking grin twitched. He had expected fumbling, noise, failure, but this was something else entirely. Beginner's luck, he muttered under his breath, though no one around him seemed to hear. Their attention was no longer on him. It was on the man at the piano. Keanu's posture remained calm, his expression serene. He wasn't performing for applause nor for the approval of the wealthy crowd. It was as though he was lost in another world, where only he and the piano existed. The melody deepened. The quiet whispers of notes began to swell into something more. They told a story, of love cherished, of loss endured, of silent strength. Each rise and fall of the music painted emotions on the faces of the listeners. One by one, the room began to change. The smirks disappeared. The whispers faded. Silence, thick and reverent, filled the grand hall. For some, the music stirred hidden memories. A woman in pearls clasped her hands tightly, recalling a childhood lullaby her mother once played. A young man's eyes welled as he remembered the father he lost too soon. Even the waitstaff, who had been gliding silently with trays of champagne, paused near the walls, their eyes drawn helplessly to the piano. And at the center of it all was Richard, who now sat frozen in his seat. His fingers gripped the stem of his wineglass, knuckles whitening. He forced a laugh, hoping to break the spell, but no one joined him, because the spell was real. Keanu's playing had stripped the room bare of arrogance and laughter. It left only truth, raw and undeniable. The final notes of his opening melody faded like a sigh. For a heartbeat, the hall was silent. No applause, no laughter, just stunned stillness. Then Keanu shifted. His hands, now fully alive with energy, descended once more on the keys. The soft whispers transformed into a stronger, bolder melody, powerful, commanding, unstoppable. And as the new rhythm surged through the hall, one thing became clear. This was no accident. This was mastery narrator's voice. What began as a whisper was becoming a storm. And with every note, the man they mocked was rewriting the very air they breathed. The audience leaned forward as one, drawn into the unfolding symphony. And Richard Beaumont? His glass slipped slightly in his grip. For the first time that night, he was afraid. The storm had begun. Keanu's fingers no longer whispered across the piano. They commanded it. Each note fell like raindrops, then thundered like waves crashing against unseen shores. The soft, uncertain melody that had lulled the hall into silence transformed into a soaring symphony, bold, unyielding, alive. It wasn't just music anymore. It was a voice. The piano spoke of things words could not, of pain carried quietly through years, of grief buried yet never forgotten, of resilience born in the silence of loneliness. And with every crescendo it told of hope that refused to die no matter how cruel the world became. The crowd was transfixed. The arrogant laughter that had filled the hall earlier was gone, replaced by faces softened with awe. Shoulders that had stiffened in superiority now slumped, disarmed by the truth flowing through the keys. An elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. A young man, once laughing cruelly with Richard, now sat forward, hands clasped, as though afraid to miss a single note. Even the waiters, forgotten in their silent labor, stood rooted where they were, trays trembling slightly in their hands. Richard Beaumont, the architect of this humiliation, sat frozen. His smirk had vanished entirely. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting around as though searching for someone, anyone, still laughing with him. But there was no one. The room was no longer his. It belonged to Keanu. The music swelled higher, brighter, burning through the golden hall like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. And with it, memories bloomed in the hearts of the listeners. One woman remembered her first dance at a wedding long ago, when love was new and endless. Another man saw the face of his late father, teaching him patience through silence. A child sitting beside her mother clutched her hand tighter, not understanding the depth but feeling the truth of the sound. Keanu's playing was no performance. It was confession, revelation. It was humanity itself laid bare on ivory keys. Richard shifted again, desperate to regain control. He let out a sharp laugh, forcing his voice into the silence. "Impressive trick," he called out, though his voice cracked. But anyone can play with a little practice. No one turned to him. No one cared. His words fell like stones into an ocean, swallowed instantly by the tide of music. The room belonged to something greater now. Keanu's face remained calm, almost serene. His eyes were half closed as though he too had left the room, lost in a world only the music could reach. His body swayed gently with the rhythm, every motion effortless, natural, honest, and then the melody shifted once more. The strength gave way to tenderness. The storm softened into quiet rain. Notes fell gently like tears sliding down a cheek. The audience leaned closer, hearts aching with the sudden vulnerability. It was as though the piano itself had begun to cry, not from weakness but from the strength it takes to reveal pain without shame. A young woman gasped softly. "It's beautiful," she whispered, though her voice trembled. Her words broke the silence just enough to remind everyone they were still in the hall, still witnesses to something extraordinary. Keanu's hands lingered on the final note of the passage, letting it echo into stillness. The sound seemed to float, shimmering, refusing to die, and when it finally faded, there was no applause, not yet. The silence was too sacred to break. The crowd stared, caught between worlds. Their hearts had been pulled into something they could not explain, and they hesitated to return. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. His arrogance was collapsing, crumbling under the weight of something he couldn't fight. He had meant to humiliate this man, to strip him of dignity, but now he was the one stripped bare, exposed, trembling before a truth greater than his wealth. Narrator's voice. What began as mockery had turned into revelation, and the man they laughed at had given them a glimpse into the very soul of humanity. Keanu lifted his hands gently from the keys. He looked up, meeting the eyes of the silent crowd. His expression was unchanged, calm, humble, almost as if he hadn't just transformed the entire hall. And in that fragile silence, the audience realized something profound. They hadn't just witnessed music, they had witnessed truth. For a moment, the hall remained silent. No one dared move, no one dared breathe, as though the final note still lingered in the air, fragile and untouchable. Then, like a spark setting fire to dry leaves, it began. A single clap, then another, and then an eruption. The room thundered with applause. Guests rose to their feet, chairs scraping back across marble as the entire hall stood in ovation. Their hands came together with desperate force, not out of politeness, but out of a need to release the emotion that had consumed them. Some shouted, "Bravo!" Others whistled. Many simply clapped with tears running down their cheeks. For the first time that evening, the hall was united, not by wealth, not by arrogance, but by awe. Keanu bowed his head gently, his calm smile unshaken, as though the storm he had unleashed was nothing extraordinary. To him it was just music. To them, it was revelation. But not everyone was celebrating. Richard Beaumont sat frozen in his chair, his face pale beneath the glow of the chandeliers. His hands trembled around the stem of his wine glass, though he tried desperately to hide it. The applause around him felt like thunder aimed directly at his pride. This was supposed to be his victory. He had wanted humiliation, mockery, laughter at another man's expense. Instead, he had been silenced, overshadowed, forgotten. The crowd that once laughed at his jokes now looked at him with thinly veiled contempt. He forced a laugh, hollow and strained. Well, that was entertaining, but no one joined him. The applause drowned his words. And worse, no one cared. One by one, the guests turned their eyes toward Richard, and for the first time that evening, there was no admiration in their gaze. Only disgust. The young woman in silver who had laughed earlier whispered sharply to her friend, "I can't believe I laughed with him." The elderly man who had closed his eyes during the music shook his head. "Foolish boy," he muttered, not about Keanu, but about Richard. Even the waiters, usually invisible, exchanged glances of quiet satisfaction. Richard felt the shift. The ground beneath him, once steady with power and wealth, had vanished. He had no control anymore. Keanu, meanwhile, remained composed. He rose slowly from the piano bench and bowed once more, not as a performer basking in glory, but as a humble man acknowledging the moment. When the applause finally softened, he spoke. His voice was calm, almost gentle, yet it carried effortlessly through the hall. "Music," Keanu said, "does not ask who you are, what you wear, or how much you own. It speaks the same to every soul. If you are willing to listen." The room held its breath. The simplicity of his words cut deeper than any insult could. He turned his gaze toward Richard, not with anger, not with triumph, but with quiet truth. "Respect," he continued, "should never depend on wealth. It should never depend on appearances. Every person carries something worth hearing." The silence that followed was heavier than the applause had been. Richard squirmed under the weight of it, every eye on him, every heart silently judging. For the first time in his life, Richard Beaumont had nothing to say. Keanu stepped away from the piano, his hands relaxed at his sides. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to shame. The music had already done what words never could. Guests parted as he walked through the crowd. Some reached out, touching his arm gently, whispering thank you. Others simply bowed their heads as he passed.
As though in respect to something greater than celebrity.
Greater than talent, respect for truth. Richard sat slumped, his glass untouched, his power stripped. He had tried to turn Keanu into a joke. But now he was the joke. Narrator's voice. In one night, the wealthy man's arrogance was silenced, and the man he mocked had not only won their respect, but had reminded them of a truth too often forgotten. Dignity belongs to everyone. The hall that once echoed with shallow laughter now buzzed with reverence. And at the center of it all, Keanu walked calmly, humbly, as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. The chandeliers still glowed above, their golden light shimmering across the marble hall. But the atmosphere inside had changed completely. Where once there had been arrogance, mockery, and shallow laughter, now there was reverence, humility, and quiet reflection. Keanu Reeves had already stepped down from the piano, moving gracefully through the hall with that same unshakable calm that had defined him from the moment he entered. Guests parted instinctively, allowing him a clear path as though they knew they were in the presence of something far greater than fame or wealth. Some whispered his name. Others simply bowed their heads slightly as he passed. For many, it was not the recognition of a celebrity. It was the recognition of a soul that had touched theirs in ways they hadn't expected. Richard Beaumont, meanwhile, sat stiffly in his chair. The applause had long since faded, but the shame lingered like smoke after a fire. His once proud posture was gone, replaced by a slump of defeat. His face was pale, his hands cold. He wanted desperately to escape the weight of the moment, but he could not. The hall's whispers surrounded him. I can't believe he tried to humiliate him. Imagine mocking someone like that. He's the one who looks foolish now. Every word pierced him. For years, Richard had thrived on admiration, on being the center of attention, but now every pair of eyes saw him for what he was. Not a leader, not a man of power, but a man of weakness, exposed by the very person he tried to break. Keanu paused at the edge of the hall near the great double doors. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. The room fell into silence once again, as though waiting for him to speak, and speak he did. You see, Keanu began, his voice steady, gentle, yet powerful enough to carry through the hall. Kindness costs nothing. Respect costs nothing, but the absence of them can cost you everything. Every ear listened. Even Richard, though he tried to look away, could not. Keanu continued. We live in a world where appearances often deceive us. A suit can hide cruelty. Simple clothes can cover greatness. But true worth is never in the fabric. It is here. He placed his hand lightly over his chest. It is in the way we treat others, in the way we choose to see them. Do we look at someone and judge them by what they wear? Or do we look deeper and recognize a human being carrying struggles we may never understand? The guests shifted uncomfortably, reflecting. Many of them had been guilty of the same instant judgment Ashley had shown earlier, the same arrogance Richard had paraded. Keanu's eyes softened, his tone warmer now. Every day you will have a choice, to look down on someone or to lift them up, to close the door or to open it. Tonight this choice was placed before one man, and what he chose showed us all how much damage arrogance can do. Richard flinched. The words were not cruel, but they carried the weight of truth. Keanu did not linger on him. Instead, he turned his attention back to the rest of the hall. I am not here to shame anyone. I am here to remind us all. Dignity does not belong to the wealthy or the powerful or the famous. Dignity belongs to everyone, and it is our duty as human beings to honor it. For a moment there was silence. No applause, no whispers, just silence, heavy and profound as his words sank deep. Then gently Keanu inclined his head in a bow. Without another word, he turned and stepped through the double doors, leaving the hall behind. Outside, the night air was cool. Beverly Hills sparkled with neon lights, sports cars gliding slowly across wide avenues. Keanu walked quietly down the steps, his hands in his pockets, his expression serene. He had said what needed to be said. The rest was not his to control. Inside, however, the impact was immediate. Guests sat quietly, reflecting. Some stared at their glasses of wine without drinking. Others exchanged looks of quiet guilt. A few even rose from their seats, gathering their coats, as though unable to continue their evening in the same shallow manner after what they had witnessed. And Richard Beaumont remained seated, frozen. His empire of pride had crumbled in a single night. He stared at the piano where Keanu had sat, the memory of the music still echoing in his ears. For the first time, he felt something he had never felt before. Regret. Narrator's voice. That night, a man who thought himself untouchable was reminded of his own fragility, and a man mocked for his simplicity revealed a truth that silenced arrogance, inspired hearts, and left behind a lesson that no one in that hall would ever forget. As the camera fades from the glittering hall to Keanu, walking calmly under the city lights, the final words echo. In a world where you can be anything, choose to be kind. For strength is not in wealth nor in pride, but in compassion, humility, and respect.